with the project on government oversight. And thanks so much for Amy and Access Now for having us here, and Drew and everyone else who's been organizing everything. It's going to be a blast. You guys already know that. It already has been with our first few sessions. But here, where we're going to move a little bit past the past, if you will, and talk more about what's going on in these ecosystems today. And I'm going to have everyone actually introduce themselves a little bit because we have really a wealth of knowledge and experience both in the public and private sector. And if I try and introduce them all, I will mess it up somehow. So we're going to go ahead and start with Afua right here to my right.
Great. Good morning, everyone. You can all hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Afua Bruce, as has been said. I'm currently the Director of Engineering for New America's Public Interest Technology Program. Essentially, our Public Interest Technology Program, we have a team of technologists, as you might imagine, that work with a number of state and local governments and nonprofits on helping them design both technology and policy better together. Before landing at New America, I worked at the White House, running the National Science and Technology Council, where we thought lots about privacy and data and all of that. And prior to that, I was at the FBI in their Science and Technology branch, and so saw a different side of what data and privacy and tracking information means and looks like.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Nguyen. I'm a product designer and researcher focusing on data privacy and human rights. I'm currently housed as a graduate fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, and I do a lot of work focused in precision medicine with NIH's All of Us, their Million-Person Genome Project, and the Precision Medicine Project with Johns Hopkins. So I look a lot at data privacy in the context of what does it look like to examine my biomatter and bodies outside of my body into data. And before this, I was at U.S. Digital Service at the White House, housed on teams with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, Department of State, and Department of Education.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Kissner. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer of a startup called Humu. Since you probably haven't heard of us, we take peer-reviewed science about people and data processing and a lot of security and privacy and use that to help people make their work better. Before that, I was the global lead of privacy technology for Google and built the product privacy organization there, built a lot of their security for infrastructure and anonymization and a lot of other things. I care a lot about building great things that are respectful of people.
Hello, my name is Maurice Turner. I'm a senior technologist at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm a member of the Internet Architecture team, where I focus on election and cybersecurity, which has some very interesting crossover into the data privacy and data security space. So thank you for having me.
Great. So like you can tell, I was not lying about everyone having huge wealths of experiences that I'm really excited that we're all going to share and dig into today. And I really want to start with people at the center of it and who the users are and how much we think the users know about what is data and how it's collected about them. Does anybody want to start? Anyone want to jump in with me?
Sure. I'll start. I mean, I think data is collected everywhere all the time, as we all know. And as far as users, I think there are varying levels of both understanding of what data is, understanding of how data is captured, and understanding of how data is applied, but even more so how data then informs what you have access to and how your life looks like. I think that in general, organizations can be much more upfront and transparent, as I'm sure we'll talk about more, as to what the data is used for, how it's kept secure or not secure, and how it is private or freely shared with other organizations and other entities.
So part of my work is interviewing and being in the field with users as they're using certain products and services and talking with them about the value that they gain from being a part of something, using a product. And I mean, the broad kind of thread is that privacy is amorphous. It has a different definition for every person, given their context, the culture, the time, and the place. And I think that is first foundationally what I think we need to understand is when we talk about privacy, it really does mean something different for every person. The other anecdote that I'll pull out is straight from an interview that I had with a person who was using Facebook, and she was saying, I remember when I was using MySpace. If any of you remember Tom from MySpace, Tom was your first friend. Tom was your first friend that showed up in your top 8. Everyone remembers that pixelated photo. And the interesting thing about that is she mentioned, I remember because I was friends with Tom, I assumed that MySpace could see what I was posting, could see who my friends were. Fast forward 20 years to today, Tom doesn't necessarily exist on our Facebook pages or our Twitter pages, but that dynamic of someone is watching still remains. And so I think given certain visual cues and how those interfaces have changed over time, really has impacted the way that users expect that people are watching.
I'll jump in here. One of my favorite examples of people in general not really understanding how impactful their data decisions can be. It just happened yesterday. There's a trending topic on Twitter about if you change your birthday to 2007, you get these crazy new colors in your timeline. But what happened is that it made sure that you were definitely under 13 and your account got locked out. And all of that was written into Twitter's policy. It was readily available for anyone to read. Supposedly everyone who joined Twitter has read that. But people didn't realize the impact of making a very small, almost innocuous change, and they were doing it for a even smaller, innocuous reason. So it reminded me yet again that these little bits of data are very powerful, and that data integrity is a very important issue. You make sure we have the right data out in the ecosystem, otherwise it can have some pretty dangerous unintended consequences.
I really like that example a lot. I know that I think Ryan Mack over at BuzzFeed, who is a technology reporter, chested it out and got blocked from his Twitter account for it. And I think it really does highlight what I see as an active observer in the space, that there seems to be very consistently a large gap between people's actual understanding and reliance on a lot of the tools and services and how their information is actually used. Are there any other sort of really jarring or revealing examples that you guys have been thinking about lately?
I mostly think about this from the perspective of user research, right? Because if you don't ask people, and a very, very wide variety of people, what they think is going on, you're never going to know. So there's some published research that came out of my old team at Google where we went around and asked a whole lot of people, hey, when you push the delete button, what do you think happens? And people thought all kinds of really interesting things. But one of the things I found the most interesting was most people didn't think it actually deleted your information. So we had to go back. You can actually see the results of some of this work when you look at the new Google privacy policy, that we tried to explain it very, very clearly, like, really, when you push the delete button, like it really gets deleted. It's all gone. And even experimenting with all of these different analogies like shredders and setting it on fire and all sorts of things, that even serving that one population or those couple of populations we studied, that was a start. But then we had to go and start looking at other populations all over the world because everybody's analogies are different and how everybody thinks about it is different. And a lot of how I see these interfaces being designed, people will assume that everybody thinks like they do. And people will assume that everybody knows everything that they do. And they will measure, when they're doing user experience research, they'll say, I'm going to measure the opt-in rate. And they won't necessarily figure out, hey, people are not necessarily, maybe people are not thinking that they're getting the right thing, or there might be people misclicking, as opposed to measuring what you want to know, which is, are people using these settings in appropriate ways that will make them happy down the line?
How realistic is it to expect your average user or consumer of a service to read most of their terms and conditions?
Are you saying you don't read all of the terms and
All of them?
conditions? Every
Yes,
single time?
I'm super
with
honest
every
that I do
single
not.
application?
And I'm a tech reporter.
And I think that that's our answer, right? Even those of us who are in technology who understand the implications of how data can affect our lives. Several of us, I would venture to guess, do not read every single line of the terms and conditions every time. And so if we have a vested interest and know what can happen, aren't doing it, then I think we should assume that your average user also probably isn't spending days of their lives reading them.
Sorry, go ahead.
Definitely agree with Afua, and I think the industry is talking about this, like that sort of moment of consent. How can we design better consent? How can we make things more legible? Does our text need to be more readable at a third grade level? Like, these are the types of conversations that are happening, and I would argue we need to shift away from how do we make consent better to how do we look at the entire experience and really place the responsibility on the people who are making these products and services to ensure that consent isn't just one moment in time, but it is looked at across many moments and ensured that you're constantly sharing information back and forth, obviously to an extent, so that you're not overbearing the user.
Yeah, things that are in context tend to perform much better. Things which are which somebody might not like, you assume that they're going to flail at them randomly with their finger, and it should take them to somewhere where they can make whatever it is stop. That tends to work really well. But also, I have this rule of thumb where if a product team comes to me and they say, I want to design this feature, and I'm like, is this going to work well for everyone? And they're like, it's okay, I'm going to make a setting. And I'm like, rule of thumb, if you think you need to make a new setting for your feature, you probably designed your feature wrong. Go back up, think about humans and try again.
Yeah, I certainly agree that the expectation that people will read is just the first step. There's also the consideration of will they understand it, and even if they do understand it, what do they do if they disagree? How do they contact the company to say, you know what, I think about 95% of this is okay, but there's this one clause here where I have an issue. Is there even room for negotiation? Can you even use part of a product or part of a service if you only agree with part of the terms of service?
There's also, I think, a question of how when you disagree with a service, but participating in that service is essentially essential to participating fully in modern society. Yes, I can decide not to be on Twitter, but that's going to have, bad impacts for my ability to share messages and do promotion. We've seen sort of some of the legal cases around, is it a First Amendment problem for members of the government to block people on Twitter because it's disengaging their ability to engage in a free and open speech as, sort of guaranteed by our Constitution, theoretically. But we've been talking mostly about sort of individual people here, and I think we were at a good place to shift to an outer ring. So who are the people collecting the data? Who are the major players, and what stakes and incentives are they dealing with right now?
A lot of the major players are people who nobody really talks about. A lot of major players are people like data brokers who buy information and they sell information. So you've seen people like British Telecom. They don't do this anymore to my knowledge, but they actually injected ads by injecting code into people's web pages, which made all the security people very upset because that is very insecure. We had Verizon with super cookies, right? We end up with a lot of websites having code on them so that when you fill in a form but you don't even submit it, it takes that text and they'll sell it to data brokers. So there's a whole layer of stuff that's going on underneath the surface. Sometimes you'll see that show up in things like ad targeting, where if they go through some of these kind of sketchy ad networks where they'll say, I know. Or they will do remarketing where they say, I want to target these particular people. So I think there's this whole layer of it. And we saw it recently with the location stuff where mobile providers were selling everybody's real-time location from their cell phones. And this stuff is the stuff that is just not as visible.
Does anybody else want to weigh in?
Another source of data collection that we don't necessarily talk about would be the government, right? So governments at all level, local, state, federal, they're always collecting data, and they're the only entities that can actually compel data collection, both from the individuals, but also from other sources of data, like data brokers or organizations. So you're thinking about things like your birth date, social security number, that's something that's assigned and sort of travels around with you in unexpected ways. I know when I was going to college, my social security number was my student ID, which is sort of a horrifying thought now, but that was a standard practice. How else were you going to identify someone in a numeric fashion if you needed to sign them up for sort of an email address or other administrative uses? And so I think that, from my perspective in the election world, all of that data is very valuable, and it's just available usually at little to no cost, because the idea is that it is only going to be used for good. Who else would want to use major sources of information like a statewide voter registration database, right? So it's available with very little friction. In DC, you can just download the spreadsheet of everyone's name and their voting history and their party affiliation. Other states charge you a nominal fee, maybe just a couple of dollars to get that information. And that is a gold mine if you're talking about a data broker that wants to aggregate a known good data set. You don't have to worry about people necessarily typing in their name wrong or putting in their address incorrectly. That is a solid data set that can be used to be combined and leveraged in some pretty damaging ways.
So we talked mostly about the kind of data that it's like related to your online activities or your voter registration, sort of things that people at least sort of, I feel like at a general sense know, well, somebody's keeping track of that somewhere, or even if they may not understand the exact mechanics of it. But how are we heading into another space when we're talking about remote biometrics and Internet of Things and biometrics from like CCTV cameras and connectivity? How much of our lives is ultimately becoming measured and collected on in new ways that people may not understand?
So, I'll comment on a lot of the individuals who I've interviewed who have donated blood samples, urine samples, measurements of their bodies, Fitbit data and information. Everything you can imagine that sort of links to themselves as a human and a body on this earth. And I think one framework that I really want to pull out is T.S. Eliot has a framework. It's data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And one of the questions that he asks is, where is the wisdom lost in information? And that sort of framework and thinking, how do we get from data, which is really low level, all the way to meaning, which is what a lot of people are doing when they are participating in something like 23andMe or some sort of genetic ancestry website. They're trying to figure out, how does this information give me meaning on who my ancestors were? Maybe it helps me understand who I am better. Maybe it'll help you understand that you are more likely to eat salty foods over sweet foods. Like, that's the type of information that users are trying to decipher and that companies are really looking to try and do in some way.
Like that sweet and salty thing, I'm definitely more of the sweet person. It's a problem, actually. But it also reminds me of another example of where users give up a lot of information for one reason and then find out, I guess this is also really useful for this other reason that I didn't expect. Because we've seen, for instance, a lot of the DNA databases being used to solve like cold crimes and unsolved murders, where they figure out, we found some DNA and like somebody's like second cousin is in here, and then from that we can make educated guesses about who a potential suspect could be, which I think brings in a lot of questions about if we're giving up this information for the express purpose of figuring out like where my ancestors came from and what my personal medical genetic preferences are. How much can we expect for that data in the current ecosystem to be used for something else ultimately?
I think in regards to that specific example, because the policies around it and the laws around it are still evolving, if you consent to give your data away for one purpose, it is very likely that it could eventually be used for another purpose. We've seen, as you mentioned, home DNA testing databases have then been given over to law enforcement, including my former employer, and the like. So I think that's very possible. I think it's very likely in lots of scenarios. And so we have to think about how do we educate lawmakers as to what types of regulations and practices should be instituted around this.
Can I give the tech plug? Which
Yes.
is we are in a space where privacy engineering is becoming more and more of a solid field, and not in every case, but there are definitely some cases in which we can maintain some kind of utility for certain purposes of data and remove other kinds of utility. So that's been really helpful in terms of making sure that we have limited purposes regardless of how we might change our minds later. It doesn't do everything yet, but it allows us to have more, like a greater space of possible answers than we would have before.
Sort of staying on this idea of murders, which, sorry guys, it's actually like a whole thing that aesthetically I'm really into right now. But it's another question when dealing with a lot of these databases has been, how do I get myself removed from this? And there's been some really interesting articles, I forget the exact author, but I will try and tweet links out to it later, where a reporter went through the process of trying to figure out how to remove themselves from all of these data sets and found that they actually couldn't in a lot of cases due to state laws. So I'd really like to talk about how that regulatory impact from state versus federal and that changing landscape makes it harder or easier to protect your privacy or figure out even what the rules are when you're a consumer navigating this space. How do you know where to even look in a lot of these places?
So I'll comment from the user perspective and then the data collector perspective. One tension that I constantly see over and over again is privacy to a data collector might mean something like, okay, how do we ensure a user has autonomy? How do we ensure that they have anonymity if they want? It's sort of like on a broad, higher level of privacy definition that you can imagine. For a user, it is something like, how do I make sure, A, the government, and B, an insurance company does not have access to my financial information? And so those two definitions might hover over the same spaces, but are defined very differently in terms of how they impact their lives. And so I think that sort of is a nuance in the way that we talk about privacy broadly versus privacy, how it actually impacts people on a day-to-day level is very different.
What do you think can help us have those conversations about the day-to-day privacy and making the system more usable for the individuals who are actually having to interface and navigate it?
So I think that we need to be looking to have this conversation in a lot of different places. I think right now these conversations are held in meetings like this with people who are actively engaged in thinking about privacy and data and its impacts, but we need to start to find ways to broaden the conversation, to use language that the general public can understand and educate the general public, to talk about it in schools, not just in computer engineering classes or computer science classes or a specific legal class, but broadly, how do we educate people on, as technology evolves and really permeates your entire life, how you interact with data and how you should understand data also affect your life? I think we really need to look to broaden the conversation and have it in more places.
And we need to do that in a way that is very respectful of the fact that people have limited time, limited energy, and limited expertise in order to grapple with some of these problems. We can't expect them to have that much time. Professor Bridges at BU Law has some amazing work about lack of privacy and bodily autonomy for poor women of color during pregnancy, right? Those women are very busy. They have a lot of things to do, and they have a very limited amount of power in that situation. So looking at how do we, make goals around this that are responsive to everybody's needs, and understanding that not everybody has the same needs, I think is really, really important as part of this conversation.
I think another thing we can do is, potentially shift the conversation away from how can we make consent better, how do we make privacy better, to how do we incentivize large data collecting institutions to want to give societal benefits in some way. So imagine a private insurance company, what incentivizes them to actually care about opening that data to improve medical treatments, to improve how we price treatments. I think that is the conversation that we need to have, is like, what is going to incentivize a Facebook? What is going to incentivize an insurance company, a Comcast, a Verizon, to actually use all that information that they're collecting and actually benefit society in some way?
Well, it's really tricky because we have to build a space in which that can happen. So, for example, Google made something called flu trends, that went and said, hey, you're probably seeing a bunch of flu recently, or it actually had another one that was related about food poisoning. And I am not the public policy team, but I got a bunch of flack for that. And that stuff wasn't not made for profit, I can promise you. And if we want to have that, that's something that we need to make a space for in society with appropriate controls around it.
Is part of that having more of a conversation about stronger rules and regulations on people providing the services rather than pushing a lot of the responsibility onto consumers?
Certainly, we've seen that notice and choice just doesn't work, and that the efforts that we've seen by the companies are, with transparency reports, things like that, those aren't working. Self-regulation's not working because it's all compliance-driven. It's after the harm has already been felt by the consumers, and there's just some avoidance of either lawsuits or the threat of regulation down the road. And so, I think it goes back to the point of how do you incentivize companies from a positive point of view to really want to share and make the ecosystem better. I can't imagine that companies are all that thrilled about being involved in such a complex ecosystem where they may not have as much control as they think they want to have. And so there needs to be a critical mass of companies standing up, wanting to do the right thing, and be upfront and clear to the consumers, to the users who are ultimately providing and should be benefiting from the data.
So for what it's worth, I hear from a bunch of companies who want to build great products, and so they are starting to figure out that they want to build great things, and so they need to build things that respect users. And there's more of a gap at least for the companies that I talk to, in figuring out how to do that. What kind of infrastructure do you need? What kind of user research do you need? How do you think about it? There aren't enough people who have that expertise right now. Honestly, I've been literally running the largest privacy engineering training program in the world because I couldn't hire out a team. And so there are a lot of people where there's a practice gap more than a desire gap. And I'm hoping that will continue to pull the field along.
So I think it's really encouraging that you're hearing from lots of companies that that's what they want to do to keep the humans who essentially keep them in business, to keep them at the center of the process and the center and respect them. But how do we get to filling that gap that you said that you found?
Can I plug my conference?
That's really what networking conferences are about. So very briefly, but then we're going to move on. Professor Lori Craner at CMU, one of the people who started up the first privacy engineering master's program, and I have started a conference called PEPPER, which is Privacy Engineering Practice and Respect, starting this August. And so we're really trying to bring people together, systematize the privacy engineering field, and try to bring forward solutions that people can use to solve problems in practice. Now, I don't think this will solve all of the problems, but because there are going to be people who just don't care, people who are bad actors, and we're going to need some sticks as well as carrots. But it's a place to start.
Great.
talking about sort of needing sticks and carrots and incentives, do we want to just have a little bit of a canvas here of what our panelists think are the current incentives in terms of data collection for a lot of the big players in here right now? We've talked sort of broadly about how there are sort of invisible people to a lot in terms of data collection to a lot of everyday users, your ISP, your web trackers and data brokers who sell things, tech companies who are directly collecting data from your user experiences, and then, you know, all of the cameras everywhere that we're also carrying around in our phones now, and like geolocation data that's collected through that. What are the current business incentives and how are we seeing those play out right now?
I can talk about one experimental genomics company that I just interviewed the other day. They are, their business model is actually trying to get people to donate their genome, and so that they can sequence it to them and give them meaning from their data. The twist is that they're actually paying users for this data, and the user can decide, oh, I want to include my genomic sequence for this research study, and this, and this, and this. And the interesting thing is, I don't know if we know that money is the incentive for users to participate in something like this. A lot of what's sort of coming through this type of research is, you know what, they might actually, especially if someone who has a certain disease, might be more incentivized to participate in a genetic research study because they want to say, I want to make sure that my generation of grandchildren have the opportunity to understand and prevent and really prolong their life and happiness. And so I think when we talk about incentives, a lot of people potentially sometimes jump to monetary incentives, where in some cases, the bigger picture of like the future generation actually might be the thing that propels them to give their data back to these communities.
Has that company, sorry, I just wanted to ask, has that company seen the psychological effect where if you start bringing in in monetary incentives into an area where there were only non-monetary incentives before, whether people who weren't getting paid and didn't want to be paid necessarily get paid, and then they're like, oh, that's not enough money, and then they drop out? I wondered if they're seeing any of those sort of effects.
Yeah, I mean, I think those experiments and those research questions are still into play. I don't have an answer to that, but I do think that sometimes it was most surprising that it didn't matter to a lot of people who just wanted to do good in the world and to produce information that will benefit a community for a health reason.
So for consumers, it may not always be a profit incentive, but what about for a lot of the businesses?
I think a lot of businesses are in the business to make money. And so things that we can do to ensure that they can continue to make money, I think we have to align with the motives of the business, which, especially in today's environment where if you have 1 or 2 quarters of not even negative growth, but slowed growth, your sustainability is in question. So I think our incentives do need to align with the profit-making incentives of a lot of businesses.
Along with that, it's just too easy to collect the data, so why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you collect as much as you possibly can, knowing that you might be able to find a use for it later, your company might be more valuable from an acquisition standpoint, or just that you want to have that longitudinal aspect to the data that you're collecting. So if you just collect as much as you can while you can, you at least have it, because you really can't go back in time and collect the old data in the same way. And so if you do have it, then it's at least of some benefit to you, and it's at the very least not a harm to have that data.
I think more companies are recognizing it as definitely can be a harm to have that data around, either because, they have to pay for storage and they have to pay for upkeep of that data, but also you don't want to have data around that you don't actually need for something, either because you are going to have various governments possibly showing up and asking you for data that users might not be happy about, or because that's just more data to get breached if something goes horribly awry. I'm not saying everybody's up on this, but there's definitely a lot of feeling that way.
And I hope that that feeling spreads.
Speaking sort of as we are a little bit about incentives, I'd also like to touch on a point that you sort of turned us in the direction there of the government incentives, and if there are conflicts between wanting to protect consumers from this fiasco of never-ending data breaches that's resulted in, for like me and I think a lot of people, something I like to call breach fatigue, where at this point I just assume all of my data is floating out there everywhere and there's not much I can do about it, and I think that has some really bad consumer implications, because if you assume and be nihilistic about your data, it kind of disincentivizes you to continue to actively monitor and try and protect that data going forward. And we've talked a little bit about how Maurice mentioned about how, potentially it's lucrative from a government perspective of having third parties protect a lot of this, collect a lot of this data because it could potentially be used for investigatory purposes later. Or how do you guys see that divide between government and the NGO world wanting to promote policies that protect data from this cascade of data breaches versus wanting to protect potential law enforcement investigatory avenues?
So this kind of parallels some of the conversation this morning, talking about the history and foundations of privacy, but these questions and concerns are definitely not new.
Yeah.
Especially given, starting in the 1700s with the Fourth Amendment, to have privacy of your home and your bodies and your sort of personal belongings, all the way to the 80s when you have the Paperwork Reduction Act, where the government is saying, hey, let's try not to collect so much data that we don't actually use in government. Let's try to be more deliberate about what information we're seeking in surveys and forms and things like that. To the Patriot Act, to privacy by design with Dan Kavukian that has been mentioned before, and to Leah's point, taking those big picture aspirational things like do no harm and translating that into actual practice is the hard kind of crux of this work.
So, not to pick on privacy by design, but like it actually taking some of those principles and looking at how they play out in practice is really hard. So, in a world where we have Fancy Bear, aka the Russians, showing up and spear phishing people and taking their data and posting it on the internet to try to influence elections, in that world, is it a more protective thing to scan people's email accounts for phishing attacks and malware, or is it more protective to not do that data processing, right? If we're asking these really hard questions about how do we protect people and how do we build something that's respectful in all dimensions, the tensions are going to be there sooner or later, and those are just so important to get to.
So this has been a really delightful conversation. I'm trying to be relatively respectful of the time limits. So I'm going to open it up here in a few minutes to audience questions. So get your ideas ready. I'm giving you a 5-minute warning that we'll be moving to audience questions. But before we do that, I'd really love to sort of go down the line here one more time and ask you guys, what are the other things that I should have been asking you about? Like, what should I be bringing up when we're talking about how to map these ecosystems now that I didn't get to? I know it sounds like a cop-out, and it is. It's one I learned through many years of journalism.
Something I'd like to see more discussion on is the use of mobile phone numbers specifically as the identifier du jour. We're moving away from this idea that a telephone number is just a household thing. Most households don't have a landline. Most people do have a telephone number, and that's being quickly replacing email addresses as a form of user ID. But necessarily, people have been giving it out very regularly, and I think that behavior probably would have changed if people had known that their phone number would be used as an identifier. The way that it's being used now will likely be used in the future. We have portability of numbers, so you basically have your phone number for life. I've had the same cell phone number for 20 years. I can't envision a scenario where I don't have that cell phone number in the future, and so that to me was something that I'd never considered before.
I aggressively make jokes about still having the area code from where I went to college as my cell phone number, and I find it's like a fun little thing. Like, you can figure out when you got your first like long-term adult cell phone based on where the area code is and what part of your life you were in.
The thing that I would say is how this is different for different populations, and how data is collected on different populations varies a lot. Like, phone numbers are a really fantastic example, and I'm really happy you brought that up, right? Those are really tricky for people, for example, trans people who are coming out and have some people knowing about certain parts of their life and some people not. How do you maintain multiple identities in a world where you may not have more than one SIM card because you may have to get more cell phones? It just doesn't work in a long-term way for a lot of communities.
Yeah. And then the idea that that number can be used, let's say you wanted to sign up for two-factor authentication because you heard that was super important, then all of a sudden that phone number is now in a wider circulation in a way that you had no idea that it was going to be used.
Facebook.
Gesundheit.
Thank you. To be clear, that actually is a reference to an actual thing that happened with Facebook where people were giving up their number for what they thought was just going to be two-factor authentication, and then they were finding, oh, we're helping it like for you to find your contacts and other things about identifying you for ad tracking purposes. Because I did not specifically prepare to mention it, I don't have an exact reference for you, but I promise you can Google it.
Topic of sort of privacy in the context, I really love that point, and I think I wanted to tell a story. I talked to my mother the other day. She's Vietnamese, and I was like, what is a Vietnamese word for privacy? And she's like, well, it depends. And I was like, well, just use a word, use any word. And she starts rattling off like 14 different phrases. She's like, it depends who you're talking to, what age they are, and what context, whether you're trying to talk about privacy as seclusion or privacy as anonymity. And I think that question sparked me to text a few friends who speak different languages, to which they all answered very similarly. I'm not really sure. It's not a commonly used word, but we use this. And I think, we're all in the United States right now. This is a very US-focused conversation. Oftentimes I hear things like, well, GDPR, the UK, biobank models in Europe. But this is not a drag and drop kind of situation. We can't just use contextual packages and things that work in a different country and try to use them here. It's worth testing, but I think exploring those questions of what is privacy across different geographic regions, cultures, context, time, even looking at, 16th century villages and what privacy looked like then until now would be a really interesting question to look into.
If you want a reference for this, there was a paper at a conference called SOUPS last year, and I believe the title started with Privacy, oh, that's for those rich women. It was a study of women in poor rural India, and there actually isn't a word, this is a different language but one of my old teammates spoke Sinhalese natively, and he's like, there is just no word. And so explaining to my parents what I do is really, really hard.
For me also, it's related to how data is collected for different populations. I'm reminded of in Allegheny County, I believe, in Pennsylvania, they had a system that collected data on people who use public services, and so unknowingly, if you had a neighbor who may have not liked you and therefore called Child Protective Services on you multiple times, and every time the police came and said, nope, there's no abuse here, the fact that Child Protective Services had been called at you at all and the police came to your house at all still went against you in the system. And so then if you tried to access different services that at any way touch this system, you had a lower chance of being able to access those services because of something else. And so as we look at how data is collected for different populations and how it can actually affect the quality of your life and what you can and can't do, I think that's a really important conversation to be having.
Thanks so much. And see, that's why I ask my pretty cop-outy question at the end, is because I always get really valuable answers from people who are smarter than me. Speaking of people who are smarter than me, I say encouraging the audience to give me questions for our panelists. Does anybody have any? Here we go.
Thank you so much for all the panelists. So in New York City, there's an ID card that gives like benefits, like discount museums, and now they're thinking of inserting smart chips into it. That is an initiative in partnership with MasterCard and other companies that have, strong defense and surveillance side business. Do you have a recommendation for how maybe advocates on the ground or other players can work through this current issue?
If it's helpful, I put together a framework on how to go through and look at different projects and try and figure out their implications, where the system failures are, where the human failures for humans are, and put that together. If that's helpful, I'm going to post that online soon. But that's because when you tell me that, the first questions I have are like, and what's going to happen to the data? Why do they want it? Because why would you want it? I don't know. But whenever somebody proposes something, there's usually some kind of a good idea there. And can we back up 3 steps and do that without doing the stuff that's going to be harmful?
I like your point that there's usually sometimes a good idea there, and really what's the minimum that we need to do as far as data collection to get there, as opposed to, I think as Maurice, maybe it was you who mentioned earlier, you might as well collect everything because you can.
Great. And do we have another question? If not, okay, we got another good person. Excellent. What I really love is an audience who is eager to find out more about our ecosystem.
Well, I'll follow up on that. I think that part of the incentive of companies, a lot of them we act with, is to collect as much data as possible. And that ties into the incentive to make data collection as normal as possible. I mean, we talk about dark patterns like two-factor authentication turning into phone number collection, but there's also efforts like Microsoft supporting face recognition ordinances that really just require notice, not even notice and choice, but making it apparent that people are using your face. What can we do to push back against the idea that data collection writ large is not just, that is normal, that it is inevitable, that it is something that happens, and instead push for a conversation about when and whether data collection is appropriate and how it should be limited and thought about consciously before the fact?
I see someone interested in fighting my data nihilism.
There's a lot of convenience in normalizing the data collection because for the consumers, there are things that can happen that normally would have taken a long time. So let's say that you're going through customs, right? Using facial recognition technology, it makes the process, minutes or even seconds more convenient for the consumers. And so I think that there's that immediate benefit that consumers can see, and there's the immediate benefit that the collectors and the business can see. But when we're not faced with the harms until a little bit further down the road, it can be difficult to make that kind of a decision and weigh, and on balance, is this something that I really want to participate in? And further to the point, is something I want to push back against to try to change. I like that idea of that notion of normalizing the data collection seems to be the goal.
Can I try and crystallize something I heard inside there? It sounds like you're suggesting that one of the things that's helpful is making costs that might be externalized, internalized to an organization, and making them apparent up front. Is that what I'm hearing in there? And speaking as a practitioner, that's something that is also helpful for us, because then when we're going and having talks with executives, we can say, well, I can put a little bit more of a number on this, because not all executives are going to have a really good intuitive feel for harms to other human beings.
So, does anyone remember Google Glass? 2012.
Glass
yes.
holes.
Okay. Funny story. I actually had a company that built Google Glass applications, and they were experimenting on things like healthcare to I guess criminal justice departments and things like that. It was like really all over the place. When I hear the word sort of making this normal, my mind goes back to that moment where all of a sudden you saw people wearing Google Glass into bars and like going to restaurants with it and getting kicked out. Like there were posters that were like, glass is not allowed in this room. And so I think a beautiful thing of society and sort of the way that technology advances is that there's always moments where we sort of stand up and say, this is not okay. I am not comfortable with someone wearing a visible cyborg thing on their head into this room and potentially video recording everything I'm doing. I mean, we all have phones and could secretly be doing that anyway, but that sort of like visual invasiveness to me was like a really cornerstone moment in how technology is really regulated by the people. And I think the more that we can kind of recognize and take these moments and say, this is not normal and this is not how I want to be treated with this data, is how I think we're going to evolve as technology continues to advance.
That makes me actually wonder, I remember that Snapchat was putting out like something actually kind of similar to Google Glass, but with where it's like mostly just taking pictures everywhere, but the marketing and the branding of it was so different. And I'm now really curious to see and check on the sales numbers for that, because if I remember, I think it also had not really taken off at all. But I remember thinking that the conversation about that product versus Google Glass was so different, and I think part of that was just the look and the feel of it, and also how some of our norms have changed about your expectation of privacy, especially in public places. I really think it's worth talking about how that is continuing to move as we are now archiving more and more things, and oftentimes streaming things live. Like we're streaming live, hello, right now, this camera, I'm waving. But also, we see people streaming things live in a lot of situations in ways that are sometimes really powerful in public policy perspectives, and as we've seen in the last few weeks, also sometimes really damaging and revealing of some of the worst aspects of our humanity. And I'd like to get some of your thoughts of our panelists here as we sort of wrap up, and then yeah, we're still going to have time for at least probably one or two more audience questions, but I'd love to have you guys weigh in on just more of the difficulty of navigating what the line is between things that are public good and public bads when we're coming to these technology tools and how our data collected is used.
Yeah, so as you were talking about the Google Glass example and the general outcry that was had, I also remembered there's a guy out of Austin, out of the US somewhere, who launched a company called Think and Zoom with Google Glass, and he has extreme visual impairment, I think is legally blind and continues to lose his vision, but he saw the Google Glass, and as it was becoming normal for people to wear that, saw an opportunity to normalize some of the visual aids that people who have need, and worked with Google Glass to essentially, you could think and zoom in on different text so that people with strong visual impairments could read, and it would be more normalized because more people were wearing these devices. And so I think that some of the tension that we still have to face is that even as technology advances, and there are lots of ways that it could be intrusive and the data could be used for bad, it's also really enabling to other people. And so how do we balance that tension, and how do we make that the technology more inclusive while still being respectful of our data? I don't know that I have a good answer today, but I think it's just something that we need to continue to actively struggle with and actively try to come up with solutions for.
Before the panel, we kind of talked about that as like, talking about it is the first step.
Exactly. Acknowledge you have a problem.
So I'm usually one of those people who are vehemently against things like, how can we use, blockchain or robots or AI to insert very large industry like healthcare or something like that. But in the spirit of being curious and trying to figure out like what is that little like sliver of good from that idea, I think oftentimes a lot of colleagues I work with tend to demonize a lot of the more tech-forward companies and organizations out there. And I think, without having organizations and teams who had visions to build rockets to the moon, we would have never had a ton of technologies that spun out from trying to build that literal moonshot vision. And so I think it's really trying to step back and figure out what is the good that can come from something like this and being open-minded to it, while also, having those checks and balances in the way of, let's not, take a random futuristic solution and just plop it into a really, really hard space to try and solve something.
Just think out our science fiction policy ideas before we implement them. So I guess we're gonna go back out to the audience.
Hi, I'm Natalie Maurice from Ranking Digital Rights. I'm wondering, since we're having, as you said, a very US-focused conversation right now, and for very good reasons, I'm wondering if you see any particularly American challenges or pitfalls in this conversation that maybe it would be helpful to acknowledge and kind of unpack and try to move past. Obviously, I'm phrasing this as a leading question because I think the answer is yes. But what I mean by that is, for example, the cultural value that we as Americans place on optimism as opposed to pessimism, and wanting to find the good and the positive in new technologies, new business practices, et cetera, as opposed to focusing on the harms. Or the fact that the benefits, the convenience and so on, tends to be very short-term and individual, as opposed to the long-term negative and more diffuse social impacts. I wonder if there are any other specifically American characteristics to this debate that you perhaps have thought about or would encourage the audience to consider.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Great man cowboy, where it's I have the vision and I'm not going to listen to anyone, right? And I'm going to, and the world will shape around me. I might have had conversations with a couple of these people. I think that seems to be a very particularly American characteristic, and I hate to use the toddler things. But, everybody needs to put on their listening ears.
I mean, another theme that I noticed is the value of the American dream and the value of democracy. And those are very large words that I think should be avoided at all costs, just because it means very different things when I say it than if you were to say it to someone else in a different context. But that is something that really resonates in a lot of the conversations that I have here, especially with immigrants who are here, is, it's my choice, it's my opportunity, it's my chance to be able to seek, the services and help and things that I need for myself and my family and my future grandchildren. And so that's a really big theme in sort of what comes out and why people get upset, is if they feel like that is going to be taken away from them.
And I'll narrow that focus a little more and say that it's almost the Silicon Valley dream that the answers to the world problems are being developed within a 50-mile radius of San Jose. And so it's a very location-specific ideal that if your dream is big enough, you will come to this specific geographic location and you will have the opportunity to change the world. And I'm not sure that there are other places outside of the US or even within the US where it is that pinpoint to say that the world will change from here.
As you were asking the question, and as you were talking earlier about the sort of collect it all mentality, I was thinking in my mind, it's almost like a data manifest destiny that we have this. A lot of companies seem to have this idea that we deserve to collect it all, and we should, and it will help us build beautiful, great things. But the implicit point of manifest destiny is also so that you are building that upon the backs and labor of indigenous peoples that you are displacing and not talking about their contributions to. So anyways, that's my response, is that I think manifest like manifest data destiny is now a concept that I will try and further develop. We are kind of running up close in the last few minutes here of our talk, but if we have any last final questions, now is the time to get them in. And we got, I think, Peter Swire back here.
Oh, okay, that's who I am. I'm a Georgia Tech guy. Thank you. I came in late, so maybe this came up earlier on. My question's about cross-device tracking. So a lot of people have the average number of devices per person is going up, not just your cell phone, but a lot of other things. Sometimes we're logged in and we like to sync our email and our music. But a lot of times we're not logged in, and there's companies that are tracking and figuring out how to match you to other things, including your work and your personal side of life. Do you have any comments as you map the data ecosystem about cross-device tracking, whether that's a particular concern, whether there's ways to think about when it seems appropriate or not appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about a lot of these data brokers that exist in this anonymous space earlier, but I'm glad that you brought up that specific example because I think it's really interesting and ties back to some of the points Maurice was making earlier about like cell phones, but also like your thumb has a specific like ID number that's not its cell phone, that's identified with the hardware that there are a lot of people collecting who might necessarily not realize that, and then they are able to sort of aggregate and figure out much more comprehensive views of your overall digital patterns than you might otherwise realize. And I'd love to hear what our panelists think about how that space is developing.
Well, so I think what Peter's talking about more is fingerprinting sort of technologies, where people will try to figure out, oh, this is the same person, this is the same sack of meat, right, as opposed to a sack of bits, which is an account, here as over here, and what can we do about that? And like, I think we should push back on fingerprinting extremely hard, except for in a very small number of cases. There are like some anti-abuse cases where people are signing up for millions and millions of accounts, and maybe we don't want to let them do that. But one of the really interesting things about fingerprinting is fingerprinting has become more popular, as far as I can tell, since we've seen some of the privacy-preserving technologies come in. So Apple put in the intelligent tracking prevention into Safari, which, very cool, by the way. But one of the interesting things that happened is that messed with a bunch of ad providers. And not all of them. I know one very thoroughly does not fingerprint, but there are some of them that went, well, we tried to do it with cookies where people could delete them. We can't do that now. Let's go fingerprint. So we saw some actually more intrusive privacy practices that were coming from people trying to work around privacy-enhancing technologies, which is why it's so important to look at all these ecosystem effects.
I think that's a great point, and more to the stance that so many have, which is that the ecosystem itself is hostile in some cases to consumers. That was an ecosystem reaction to what is an obvious consumer choice, in much the same way that Do Not Track was supposed to solve a lot of these problems, and here we are 10 years later, basically having to give up on that idea that consumers can explicitly state, I do not want to be tracked, but the data aggregators don't want to respect that choice by consumers, and so they're finding ways around it. And fingerprinting is a very powerful reaction. I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is that would benefit consumers.
Yeah, and you sort of, sorry, I see you were going to go in too.
I think it's hard to answer that question, but I think the question we should be asking is like, what is the value of cross-referencing that data? A good example might be the weather data mixed with your activity and pedometer data, how much you've slept, and maybe there's some correlations there that might be interesting. A questionable example is, I think a few months ago, Spotify teamed up with Ancestry DNA. And so if you could go into your account and have a playlist that's created for you based on your genetic history and like the places in the world where you are from. So you can imagine, out of morbid curiosity, I did it. I didn't do Ancestry DNA, but you could say where you're from. I was like, okay, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and up came a playlist of all of this music from Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, China in some ways, and I was like, maybe I probably wouldn't listen to this again, but why is that? And it's because, the interesting experiment, But as a person, my interests do not necessarily reflect just where my genetic DNA says that I'm from. So it's sort of a mismatch in actually trying to pinpoint what type of music that I actually like, with like taking some DNA that's like not correlated at all with my personal interests and my lived experiences today.
Are you suggesting that biology is not destiny?
And I sort of wanted to make a quick shout out to the Electronic Frontier Foundation's fingerprinting tool check, which you can use to see how unique your laptop and browser settings are, and will probably scare you. So you should definitely check it out. And also sort of feedback to some of those other ecosystem things we've been talking about, and bring up one of my favorite sort of reporting things, which is like the zombie cookies things that happened with the telecom people a few years back, where the zombie cookies, which were inserted bits of tracking code that a lot of the major cell providers, I believe, including Verizon, and
I thought those were. I think if you look them up under super cookies, you're more likely to find the.
So there were super cookies and then there were zombie cookies, because they were also, once you had said no, I don't want that, they were still reinserting and recreating them. Which I think really sort of reflects a lot of the talk we're having here about how the ecosystem reacts, and the ecosystem is hostile a lot of times to the steps users take to try and protect their privacy. And what I've seen played out a lot as a reporter in the space is that they often don't stop unless it's really publicized, and then there's a backlash, and then whatever government agency will respond to it. But at that point, the behavior's already been out there for a while. As sort of a final round question here, because we are, I'm afraid, like bumping up at the edge of our time, I'd like to sort of ask, what do you think can be done to change it so it's less of a reactive system and more of an ecosystem that doesn't put consumers in that place in the first place?
I think CDT has come out strongly with our preference, which is baseline federal privacy legislation. There needs to be some foundation that is set so that everyone involved knows what the baseline is, knows where those guardrails are, so we can move forward from there. It shouldn't be this massive re-education process that consumers have to undertake, and the consumers shouldn't feel such a high level of responsibility when they don't have all the information to be able to make a decision that has some pretty serious ramifications.
And I want to call it another thing you said earlier, Maurice, which is about aligning incentives, right? Using that to align incentives is really valuable, and making it so that there's a connection between the policies that get set or what a company or organization thinks they're doing and what they're actually doing, because they can have really fantastic good intentions and screw it up. It's really, really hard to do it right. So being in a place where we have those practices and those technologies will help.
I'll just keep it short. I think it's shifting the conversation to promoting societal benefits and better incentives to do that.
And I would just echo what everyone else has said. I think regulation and accompanied enforcement of said regulation is important. I think the big companies and the smaller ones as well, as we've discussed, everyone's collecting all the data. Employing more of these privacy engineers and really thinking about it at the design is also important. And then finally, certainly making the incentives of doing good, or at least not doing harm, really align financially with the interest of businesses.
Great, and thank you guys so much, thank you people so much. It's a little quirk that I'm working on, is trying to edit out and decolonize some of my gendered language. Thank you all of you people for joining me up here. This has been wonderful, and I hope that everyone will take some time to go check out the literal sketched map, which I'm so excited to check out once I get off the stage here. Amy is doing a beautiful showcase, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much, everyone, for showing up, and I will let us all take our leave, and looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to talk about for the rest of the conference.